In a civilization that believed to speak a name was to make a soul live forever, only one pharaoh was considered so dangerous that his successors tried to delete him from existence. They dispatched teams of stonemasons to methodically chisel his name from every monument, dismantled the revolutionary capital city he built in the desert, and purged the official records to pretend his 17-year reign had never happened. For nearly 3 millennia, their campaign of forgetting was almost perfectly successful. This is the condemnation of memory, or damnatio memoriae in Latin, carried out on an industrial scale. But this is not the work of foreign conquerors seeking to humiliate a defeated enemy. This systematic campaign of erasure is being orchestrated by the dead king's own people, his own successors, his own priests and officials. They are attempting something that seems almost impossible: to make a pharaoh of Egypt disappear from history as if he had never existed at all. The target of this historical assassination was a king whose very name had become a curse, whose reign had been so catastrophic and threatening to the established order that even mentioning him meant invoking chaos itself. In the official king lists carved into temple walls, his reign is simply skipped over, as if those 17 years had never occurred. Where his cartouche once proclaimed his royal name, there are now only blank spaces, carefully chiseled voids in the stone. Later, pharaohs would refer to him only obliquely as the criminal of Akhenaten, or that rebel, refusing even to speak his name aloud. For nearly 3 millennia, this campaign of erasure worked. The pharaoh they sought to forget remained forgotten, a ghost haunting the margins of Egyptian chronology. His capital city, once a metropolis that housed tens of thousands, was completely abandoned. His revolutionary ideas, his artistic innovations, his religious upheaval, all of it seemed to have been wiped clean from the record of human history. But in the late 19th century, archaeologists working in Middle Egypt began finding unusual ruins. Buried under sand and debris, they uncovered the remains of a large, ancient city. As excavation continued, they found buildings and artifacts that revealed a story unlike anything else in Egyptian history, evidence that forced scholars to reconsider what they thought they knew about ancient Egypt. They had discovered the abandoned capital of the erased king, along with clues about why his successors had tried so hard to erase him from history. In this video, we discuss Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, the rebel king, the man who nearly destroyed ancient Egypt by trying to save it. His story raises a question that has never faded with time. When does visionary reform become destructive fanaticism? Was this systematic erasure the justified response to a dangerous madman who nearly destroyed an entire civilization? Or was Egypt erasing its greatest visionary, a man whose only crime was seeing divine truth more clearly than anyone before or since? To get an answer, we will go back to the golden age that Akhenaten inherited and understand what exactly he chose to tear down. Before we go on, please like the video and subscribe if you enjoy our content. It's the easiest way to support us and help us grow. The Egypt that Akhenaten inherited was not a kingdom in decline, desperate for reform. It was a civilization at the absolute pinnacle of its power and glory, the greatest empire the world had ever known. This was the Egypt of the mid-14th century BC, ruled by his father Amenhotep III, a pharaoh whose 38-year reign represented the apex of Egyptian wealth, international prestige, and cultural achievement. It was a kingdom so dominant, so secure in its traditions, that the very idea of fundamental change seemed sacrilegious. Young Prince Amenhotep IV grew up in a world where tribute flowed into Egypt from across the known world, like tributaries feeding the Great Nile itself. From Nubia came gold in quantities so vast that the Egyptians used it to gild entire temples. From the Levant came silver, fine textiles, and precious stones. From the mysterious lands of Punt came incense, exotic animals, and fragrant woods. The royal workshops of Memphis and Thebes hummed with activity as craftsmen fashioned this endless stream of wealth into beautiful objects. Golden furniture inlaid with ivory and lapis lazuli, jewelry that glittered like captured starlight, and ceremonial weapons that were works of art in their own right. Egyptian armies had not fought a major campaign in decades, not because they had grown weak, but because their reputation for invincibility was so complete that rebellion had become unthinkable. When foreign ambassadors arrived for an audience, they walked through a carefully choreographed display of Egyptian power, past ranks of guards in gleaming armor, through halls lined with statues of conquered enemies, and finally into the presence of a god-king who sat upon a throne of solid gold, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the very embodiment of divine authority. But Egypt's true strength lay deeper than its military might or material wealth. It lay in the bedrock certainty of its religious and social order. For 3 millennia, since the legendary unification under the first pharaoh, Menes, Egyptian civilization had been built upon a foundation of cosmic stability. The pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, the divine intermediary between the mortal world and the domain of the gods. When he died, he became Osiris, ruler of the underworld, while his son and successor took on the mantle of Horus. This was not metaphor or political theory. To the Egyptians, this was literal, cosmic truth. At the heart of this system stood the greatest religious institution in all of Egypt, the priesthood of Amun-Ra at Thebes. The Temple of Karnak was more than a building. It was a city within a city, a sprawling complex of sanctuaries, courtyards, workshops, granaries, and administrative buildings that covered over 200 acres. Its hypostyle hall alone contained 134 columns, each one massive enough that 50 men could stand on its top, their capitals soaring toward heaven like a stone forest of divine majesty. The high priest of Amun was, in practical terms, the second most powerful man in Egypt. He controlled vast estates that stretched the length of the Nile Valley, commanded armies of temple workers, and managed treasure houses that rivaled those of the pharaoh himself. More importantly, he controlled access to the god whose favor was essential for the legitimacy of royal rule. When a pharaoh needed the approval of heaven for a major undertaking, it was the high priest of Amun who entered the dark sanctuary, consulted with the god, and emerged to declare the divine will. The priesthood had become a state within the state, a parallel power structure whose influence had grown so vast that even pharaohs had to tread carefully in their presence. Yet for young Prince Amenhotep IV, this magnificent system was not a source of strength. Unlike previous royal heirs who accepted the majesty and mystery of the ancient rituals, the prince seems to have been troubled by what he witnessed in the temples. He saw priests claiming to speak for gods, who remained stubbornly silent in their dark sanctuaries. He observed the vast wealth flowing into temple treasuries, while common people struggled with poverty and hunger. He watched as the high priest of Amun wielded power that seemed to rival, and sometimes exceed, that of his own father. Most troubling of all, the prince began to question the very foundations of Egyptian theology. In a pantheon of hundreds of gods, each with their own priests, their own temples, their own complex relationships and rivalries, where was the unity that should characterize divine truth? How could there be so many gods, so many competing claims to ultimate authority, so many opportunities for human priests to manipulate divine will for their own purposes? The prince's religious awakening began with his growing fascination with a relatively minor deity in the vast Egyptian pantheon, the Aten. The Aten was not unknown. He was the solar disk, the visible manifestation of the sun's power, traditionally considered one aspect of the great sun, god Ra. But where previous pharaohs had honored the Aten as part of the complex web of divine relationships, the young prince began to see something more significant in this radiant disk that blazed across the sky each day. What attracted him to the Akhetaten was perhaps its very simplicity and immediacy. Unlike Amun, whose name meant hidden and who dwelt in the mysterious darkness of temple sanctuaries, the Akhetaten was brilliant, obvious, and undeniably present. Every day, without fail, it rose in the east and travelled across the heavens, giving light and life to all creation. It needed no priests to interpret its will, no elaborate rituals to maintain its power, no dark sanctuaries to house its presence. The Akhetaten was self-evident, universal and immediate, a god whose reality could not be questioned or manipulated by any earthly authority. As Prince Amenhotep IV matured, his theological insights began to crystallize into a vision. What if the entire traditional system was not just flawed, but fundamentally wrong? What if the complexity of Egyptian religion, its hundreds of gods, its competing priesthoods, its elaborate hierarchies, was not a reflection of divine truth, but a human-made distortion of it? What if there was only one true God, visible to all, accessible to all, requiring no intermediaries except the Pharaoh himself? This was not only religious reform, it was a complete reimagining of the relationship between heaven and earth, between gods and mortals, between pharaohs and their subjects. He was preparing to wage war not against human enemies, but against the gods themselves. When Prince Amenhotep IV became pharaoh around 1353 BC, he inherited the greatest empire on earth. But he also inherited what he saw as the greatest lie in human history: the false worship of false gods that kept humanity trapped in darkness when the true light of divine truth blazed overhead for all to see. The young king was about to discover whether the power of a pharaoh was sufficient to tear down 3 millennia of tradition and rebuild the world according to his vision. The golden prison of Egyptian orthodoxy was about to meet its most dangerous prisoner. The transformation began quietly, almost unnoticeably, like the first hairline cracks in a massive dam before the flood. In the early years of his reign, Amenhotep IV maintained the traditional facade of pharaonic piety. He performed the required ceremonies, made the expected offerings, and spoke the ancient words that had been spoken by every pharaoh for 3,000 years. But behind the ritual compliance, a theological earthquake was building that would soon shatter the very foundations of Egyptian religion. The first public sign of the coming revolution appeared in the decoration of the young pharaoh's early temples. Where previous kings had filled their monuments with the traditional pantheon, Amun enthroned in majesty, Ptah crafting the world, Thoth recording divine wisdom, Amenhotep IV's temples began to feature an increasingly dominant motif: a simple solar disk with rays extending downward, each ray ending in a small hand that seemed to reach out and touch the earth with divine blessing. This was the Akhetaten, and its growing prominence was not accidental. But it was in the 4th year of his reign that Amenhotep IV made his first truly decisive move. In a ceremony that must have stunned the assembled courtiers and priests, he publicly changed his name from Amenhotep, which meant Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, meaning beneficial to the Akhetaten. Not only this was a personal preference or a minor theological adjustment, it was also a declaration of war against the most powerful religious establishment in Egypt. To understand the audacity of this act, imagine a medieval king publicly renouncing Christianity to worship a previously obscure saint, or a Roman emperor abandoning Jupiter for a minor provincial deity. By changing his name to honor the Akhetaten, Akhenaten was making a public statement that the traditional gods of Egypt, including the mighty Amun-Ra himself, were no longer worthy of royal devotion. The counter-revolution had been declared before the revolution was even fully revealed. The theological implications were massive. The Akhetaten, as Akhenaten proclaimed it, was unlike any god Egypt had ever known. It was not a hidden deity dwelling in dark temple sanctuaries, requiring elaborate rituals and priestly interpretation. The Aten was visible to all, blazing overhead each day, giving light and life to everything that existed. Most radically, the Aten was presented as a universal god, not the patron of Egypt alone, but the creator and sustainer of all peoples, all lands, all life. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Akhenaten's theology was its exclusivity. The traditional Egyptian religious system had always been remarkably inclusive, absorbing foreign gods, creating hybrid combinations, and allowing multiple deities to coexist in complex hierarchical relationships. Akhenaten's Aten, however, demanded absolute devotion. There were to be no other gods, no divine partnerships, no theological compromises. The Aten was not only the greatest god, it was the only god. This theological radicalism was accompanied by an equally drastic restructuring of religious power. Akhenaten began to close temples dedicated to other gods, starting with smaller institutions and gradually working toward the great complex at Karnak. Temple estates were confiscated and their wealth redirected to the construction of new temples dedicated exclusively to the Aten. Priests who refused to embrace the new theology found themselves stripped of their positions and incomes. The priesthood of Amun, recognizing the existential threat to their power, did not submit quietly. They had controlled vast resources for centuries, commanded the loyalty of thousands of employees, and wielded influence that extended into every aspect of Egyptian society. The conflict between the traditional priesthood and the revolutionary pharaoh was not just theological, it was a struggle for the very soul of Egyptian civilization. Akhenaten's approach was simple and effective. By declaring the Aten the only true god, he had undermined the theological basis for the entire traditional priesthood. If there was only one god, then there was only need for one priesthood, his own. The vast temple complexes, the elaborate hierarchies, the accumulated wealth and power of 3 millennia of religious tradition became, at a stroke, not just unnecessary, but actively blasphemous. The speed of the transformation was extraordinary. Within a few years of his name change, Akhenaten had effectively dismantled the religious system that had sustained Egyptian civilization since its inception. The great festivals that had marked the rhythm of Egyptian life were abandoned or transformed beyond recognition. The complex theological schools that had preserved and transmitted religious knowledge for generations were disbanded. The intricate web of divine relationships that had explained everything from the flooding of the Nile to the movement of the stars was swept away in favor of a stark, simple theology. The Aten creates, the Aten sustains, the Aten is all. Yet there was method in this apparent madness. Akhenaten understood that the traditional priesthood had become a parallel power structure that constrained pharaonic authority. By eliminating their theological justification, he was pursuing absolute political power disguised as religious reform. The Aten religion was designed to make the pharaoh not just the king of Egypt, but the sole interpreter of divine will, the irreplaceable link between heaven and earth. But Akhenaten's revolution faced a fundamental challenge. How do you convince an entire civilization to abandon the gods that have protected and prospered them for 3,000 years? His answer was characteristically uncompromising. If the people would not willingly embrace his new theology, he would create an entirely new society built around it. He would construct a new capital city, populated by loyal followers, where the Aten's worship could be practiced without the contaminating influence of traditional beliefs. The decision to build this new capital was perhaps the most audacious act of Akhenaten's reign. It was not enough to reform existing institutions. He would create an entirely new world, a utopian city where his vision could be implemented without compromise. As Akhenaten stood on the cliffs overlooking the empty valley he had chosen for his capital, surrounded by his small circle of devoted followers, he was making a choice that would stand the test of time. He was betting the future of the greatest empire on earth on his personal relationship with a god that most of his subjects had never heard of. The golden age of Egypt was about to give way to the most ambitious experiment in religious and political transformation the ancient world had ever witnessed. In the 6th year of his reign, Akhenaten made a decision that would be either the most visionary or the most catastrophic act of urban planning in ancient history. Standing on the eastern cliffs, overlooking a desolate stretch of the Nile Valley, some 250 miles north of Thebes, the pharaoh looked out over an empty expanse of sand, rock, and scattered acacia trees. To any reasonable observer, this barren space offered nothing: no existing infrastructure, no established trade routes, no sacred sites to sanctify royal power. But to Akhenaten, it represented a reset, a fresh start upon which he could build his vision of a perfect society. This would be Akhetaten, Horizon of the Aten, a city built on the promise of a drastically different future. The site lay in a natural amphitheatre of cliffs that formed a semicircle around a broad plain on the east bank of the Nile. To Akhenaten's theological imagination, this formation represented the hieroglyphic symbol for horizon, the perfect place for the city of the sun god to rise each day with the dawn. The construction of Akhetaten began immediately. Thousands of workers were mobilized from across Egypt, their ancient skills redirected toward building a city unlike any that had ever existed. The pharaoh's architects, freed from the constraints of traditional Egyptian design, created an urban landscape that reflected the new theology's emphasis on openness and light. Where traditional Egyptian temples were designed as mysterious, progressively darker sanctuaries leading to hidden holy chambers, the temples of Akhetaten were open to the sky, their courtyards designed to capture and celebrate the direct rays of the Aten. The great temple of the Aten, the spiritual heart of the new city, was a departure from Egyptian typical sacred architecture. Instead of the traditional progression through pylons and courtyards toward a secluded sanctuary, it consisted of a series of open-air courts stretching for over 800 feet, filled with offering tables where hundreds of priests could simultaneously present gifts to the sun disk overhead. There were no hidden chambers, no mysterious sanctuaries where divine secrets were whispered. Everything was visible, direct, and revealed. Within just a few years, what had been empty desert was transformed into a thriving metropolis. The speed of this transformation was one of the greatest administrative achievements in ancient history. An entire capital city, complete with palaces, temples, government buildings, residential districts, and industrial quarters, built essentially from scratch in less than a decade. But Akhetaten was more than just an impressive feat of construction effort. It was a large-scale social experiment. The city wasn't populated by the old aristocratic families who had dominated Egyptian society for generations, but by a new class of officials and courtiers whose only qualifications were their loyalty to Akhenaten and their acceptance of his revolutionary theology. Traditional titles and honors were abandoned in favor of new designations that emphasized service to the Aten and devotion to its earthly representative. The daily life of the new capital reflected the new theology in countless ways. The city's orientation was carefully planned so that the rising sun would illuminate the most important buildings first, symbolically bringing the Aten's blessing to its faithful servants. The streets were laid out in a rational grid system, a departure from the historically influenced layouts of old Egyptian cities. Most innovative of all was the art that decorated public buildings and private homes throughout the city. Here, the rigid conventions that had governed Egyptian artistic representation for 3 millennia were swept away in favor of a new, different style, that it seemed to belong to another civilization. The human form was no longer rendered according to idealized mathematical proportions, but was depicted with startling naturalism and individual character. In these artistic representations, Akhenaten himself appeared with highly specific physical characteristics, an elongated skull, a narrow angular face, full lips, heavy-lidded eyes, and a body with feminine features, wide hips, a protruding belly, and pronounced breasts. These representations challenged every conventional notion of masculine royal power, suggesting that divine truth was to be found in honest observation of reality as it actually existed, not in idealized abstraction. For the first time in Egyptian history, royal art showed the pharaoh and his family engaged in everyday domestic activities. There are scenes of Akhenaten and his queen, Nefertiti, playing with their children, kissing affectionately, sharing meals, and simply enjoying each other's company as any ordinary family might. These images were theological statements, reinforcing Pharaoh's claim that the divine could be found in the ordinary, the natural, and the truthful, rather than in the remote and ceremonial. Nefertiti herself was presented as an equal partner in the religious revolution, and not just as a royal wife. In the art of Amarna, she appears beside her husband in scenes of divine worship, both of them receiving the life-giving rays of the Aten on equal terms. She is shown making offerings to the god, participating in religious ceremonies, and even wearing the blue crown typically associated with pharaonic authority. There are famous scenes that show Nefertiti in the typical pharaonic act of smiting Egypt's enemies, an iconographic formula that had been exclusively masculine for over 2,000 years. The royal couple had 6 daughters together, an unusual number to survive to be depicted in royal art. In traditional Egyptian royal iconography, children, particularly daughters, rarely appeared at all. But in Amarna art, the 6 princesses are everywhere, playing near their parents, reaching up to touch their faces, and generally behaving like beloved children rather than political assets. For several years, the experiment seemed to work exactly as Akhenaten had envisioned. Diplomatic correspondence from the period shows that New Capital functioned as the effective center of the Egyptian empire. Foreign ambassadors journeyed there to present tribute and negotiate treaties. The city's workshops produced some of the finest art and craft work of the period. The administration continued to function, collecting taxes and managing provincial affairs. Yet even as the city flourished, there were troubling signs that the experiment was built on unstable foundations. The city's rapid construction had prioritized speed over durability. Many buildings showed signs of hasty, sometimes shoddy construction that would not stand the test of time. More ominously, the breakup with tradition was creating growing resistance throughout the empire. Provincial officials who had grown up respecting the traditional gods struggled to adapt to the new ideology. The army, whose loyalty had always been secured through traditional religious ceremonies and appeals to martial deities, began to show signs of unrest. The entire economic foundation of Akhet'aaten was entirely dependent on Akhenaten's ability to maintain control over the rest of Egypt. The city produced nothing that could not be produced better and more efficiently elsewhere. Its only reason for existence was ideological. It existed to serve the Aten and glorify its pharaoh. The experiment was about to discover whether revolutionary idealism was sufficient to sustain a civilization, or whether the practical realities of governing an empire would ultimately prove more powerful than even the most convincing vision of divine truth. While Akhenaten was consumed with perfecting his theological vision and building his new capital, the administrative and diplomatic network that had taken centuries to construct was beginning to break down with alarming speed. The pharaoh who had promised to bring truth and light to the world was presiding over the catastrophic collapse of Egyptian international power. The clearest evidence of this collapse comes from one of the most important archaeological discoveries related to that period of history: the Amarna Letters. In 1887, a local woman found a cache of nearly 400 clay tablets covered with cuneiform script, the diplomatic correspondence of Akhenaten's foreign ministry, accidentally preserved when the city was abandoned. These letters, written in Akkadian, the international diplomatic language of the time, provide an unfiltered insight into the desperate pleas and growing desperation of Egypt's allies as the empire simply stopped responding to their needs. Rib-Hadda, the loyal mayor of Byblos, one of Egypt's most important Levantine allies, wrote letter after letter describing the advance of hostile forces, the defection of neighboring cities, and his own increasingly desperate situation. "The king, my lord, should know that the war against me is severe," he pleaded. "All my cities, which are in the mountains and on the seashore, have joined the Hapiru." But perhaps most revealing is the tone of increasing bewilderment in these letters. "Why have you not written to me?" becomes a recurring refrain. "The land of the king, my lord, is lost," wrote another correspondent. These officials clearly could not understand why the pharaoh, who had once responded swiftly to any threat, was now allowing the empire to collapse without apparent concern. The military dimension of this collapse was equally devastating. Egyptian garrisons throughout the empire found themselves isolated and unsupported as supply lines broke down and reinforcements failed to arrive. Some Egyptian forces were apparently withdrawn from frontier positions to work on construction projects at Akhetaten, leaving strategic strongholds vulnerable to attack. The Egyptian empire's reputation for strength and invincibility was evaporating as word spread that the pharaoh was more interested in worshipping his new god than in protecting his subjects. The economic consequences of the revolution were even more severe. The traditional Egyptian religious system was not only a matter of belief, it was an economic engine that employed hundreds of thousands of people and managed enormous agricultural estates. When Akhenaten closed temples and redistributed their wealth to fund his new capital, he created massive unemployment and disrupted production systems that had functioned for centuries. The craftsmen who had specialized in creating traditional religious objects found themselves without work. The farmers who had worked temple lands discovered their ancient contracts voided. The merchants who had profited from religious festivals and pilgrimages saw their livelihoods disappear overnight. Resources that should have been invested in maintaining the empire's infrastructure, roads, fortifications, irrigation systems, were instead poured into building a city that served no practical purpose beyond glorifying the pharaoh's theological vision. The finest craftsmen from across Egypt were relocated to work in the city, leaving other projects understaffed and incomplete. Perhaps most damaging was the psychological impact of the change on Egypt's administrative class. The bureaucrats and provincial governors who actually ran the empire had grown up in a world where religious certainty provided the foundation for all other activities. When that foundation was suddenly swept away, many seemed to have lost confidence in their ability to make decisions or take independent action. The detailed records and protocols that had guided Egyptian administration for centuries were suddenly declared obsolete, replaced by vague exhortations to serve the Aten and follow the pharaoh's vision. Internal resistance to the forced changes began almost immediately, but initially took subtle forms. Provincial officials continued to honor traditional gods in private while paying lip service to the Aten in official communications. Local temples found ways to continue functioning by nominally dedicating their activities to the solar disk while maintaining their traditional practices. As the empire's problems mounted, this passive resistance began to harden into active opposition. We catch glimpses of this in the archaeological record. Traditional divine names, carefully preserved in private inscriptions, secret caches of traditional religious objects, and the systematic defacement of Atenist monuments even during Akhenaten's lifetime. The military situation became particularly critical as Egypt's enemies recognized the empire's weakness and began to coordinate their attacks. The Hittites, Egypt's great rival for control of the Near East, launched a campaign to detach Egyptian allies and vassal states. Nubia, the source of much of Egypt's gold, showed signs of restiveness as traditional religious ties weakened. Even within Egypt proper, there were reports of civil unrest and challenges to royal authority that would have been unthinkable during the confident early decades of the 18th dynasty. Around the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, the royal family was struck by a personal tragedy that may have begun the downfall of the entire project. Princess Akhetaten, the second daughter, died at a young age, and her death seems to have had a significant impact on the royal couple. The scenes of her funeral, carved on the walls of the royal tomb at Amarna, show Akhenaten and Nefertiti in attitudes of genuine grief, bending over their daughter's mummy in postures of mourning that were entirely unique in royal art. It is around this time that one of the greatest mysteries of the Amarna period begins to unfold: the gradual disappearance of Nefertiti from the historical record. In the later years of Akhenaten's reign, the queen's name and image appear with decreasing frequency until she vanishes entirely from official art and inscriptions. Some scholars suggest she may have died, perhaps in the same plague that claimed her daughter. Others propose that she fell from favor, possibly due to disagreements with her husband over religious or political policy. Another theory suggests that she adopted a new name and persona, becoming the mysterious co-ruler known as Smenkhkare, who appears in the final years of Akhenaten's reign. As Pharaoh's health appears to have declined in his final years, once depicted as a figure of divine energy and confidence, started increasingly appearing in art as gaunt and prematurely aged. Whether this physical deterioration was due to illness, the stresses of governing an increasingly unstable kingdom, or the cumulative effects of whatever conditions may have caused his unusual appearance, it created a power vacuum that various court factions rushed to fill. By the later years of Akhenaten's reign, it was clear that the experiment was doomed. The empire that had dominated the ancient world was fragmenting. The economy that had supported great prosperity was contracting. The military that had made Egyptian power feared from Nubia to the Euphrates was demoralized and divided. The administrative system that had efficiently governed millions of people was breaking down under the weight of ideological confusion. Yet Akhenaten continued to insist that his revolution would ultimately triumph, that the truth of the Aten would eventually convince all people to abandon their false gods and embrace the light. He seems genuinely to have believed that temporary setbacks were simply tests of faith, and that divine favor would eventually restore Egypt to even greater heights of power and prosperity. It was a tragic miscalculation that would cost not only his own legacy, but the lives and welfare of countless subjects who had depended on Egyptian strength for their security and survival. When Akhenaten died in the 17th year of his reign, around 1336 BC, he left behind a kingdom in ruins and a revolution that had already begun to consume itself. The process of undoing Akhenaten's revolution began even before his body was cold in its tomb. The mysterious co-ruler Smenkhkare initiated the first tentative steps away from pure Atenist ideology, allowing references to traditional gods to creep back into official inscriptions. But it was with the accession of the boy pharaoh Tutankhamun that the full counter-revolution began in earnest. Tutankhamun was probably around 9 years old when he inherited the throne, the son of Akhenaten and a minor wife whose name has been lost to history. He had been born during the height of the Amarna revolution and raised in the artificial paradise of Akhetaten, surrounded by its experimental art, the simplified theology, and the utopian dreams of his father's court. Yet the child who ascended the throne would spend his brief reign systematically dismantling everything his father had built, guided by powerful court officials who had survived the chaos and were determined to restore traditional order. The boy king's original name had been Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, but one of his first official acts was to change it to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. This simple alteration was a public declaration that the traditional god-king of Thebes was once again supreme, and that the solar disk that had briefly eclipsed all other deities was being relegated back to its minor role in the traditional pantheon. The restoration decree that Tutankhamun issued provides a detailed catalogue of the devastation that Akhenaten's revolution had wrought. The temples of the gods, the decree states, had fallen into ruin. Their shrines had become desolate, their courtyards had been overgrown with weeds, and their sanctuaries had become places where no one went. The gods themselves had turned their backs on Egypt, refusing to respond to prayers or accept offerings. The army sent on expeditions had met with no success because the gods were no longer listening. But now, the decree proclaimed, the young pharaoh would set right what had been destroyed and raise up what had been demolished. New statues would be carved for the gods, new temples would be built, new priests would be appointed, and the ancient festivals would be restored with even greater magnificence than before. Within just a few years of child pharaoh's accession, the great temples of Karnak and Luxor were bustling with activity as armies of craftsmen worked to repair the damage of the Amarna period. The priesthoods that had been disbanded were reconstituted with their ancient privileges intact. The capital was moved back to Memphis and Thebes, and the magnificent city of Akhetaten was simply abandoned. The tens of thousands of people who had called it home for nearly 2 decades packed up their belongings and departed, leaving behind palaces, temples, and workshops that had cost fortunes to build. The desert city that had been intended as the eternal home of the Aten became a ghost town almost overnight. Yet even this restoration was not enough for Tutankhamun's successors. When the boy king died in his late teens, possibly from injuries sustained in a chariot accident, he was succeeded by the elderly Ai, one of the court officials who had served both Akhenaten and his son. But it was left to Ai's successor, Horemheb, to complete the systematic erasure of the Amarna period from Egyptian history. Horemheb had been a general under Akhenaten, one of the few high-ranking military officers to survive the collapse of the empire with his reputation intact. He had witnessed firsthand the diplomatic humiliations, the military defeats, and the internal chaos that the religious revolution had caused. When he finally seized the throne, he was determined not just to undo Akhenaten's policies, but to ensure that such a catastrophe could never happen again. His solution was harsh. The Amarna period would be erased from history as if it had never occurred. The campaign of erasure that Horemheb orchestrated was methodical and thorough beyond anything previously attempted in the ancient world. Teams of craftsmen were dispatched throughout Egypt with specific orders to locate and destroy every trace of Atenist monuments. Akhenaten's name was chiseled out of inscriptions. His images were defaced or completely removed, and his characteristic artistic style was obliterated wherever it appeared. The same treatment was given to depictions of Nefertiti and anyone else associated with the heretical regime. But Horemheb's campaign went far beyond simple vandalism. He ordered the systematic dismantling of Atenist temples, with their stone blocks being reused for other construction projects. The temples of Akhet'aaten were methodically torn apart, their decorated stones carted away to serve as building material for new monuments that would celebrate the traditional gods. Many of these recycled blocks were used as filling material for foundations and walls, ensuring that images of the heretic pharaoh would be literally buried beneath structures dedicated to the gods he had rejected. The official king lists were rewritten to omit the entire Amarna period. In the carefully maintained chronologies that recorded the succession of pharaohs, the reign of Amenhotep III was followed directly by that of Horemheb, as if the intervening years had simply been erased from time itself. Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, and even the innocent Tutankhamun were excised from the official record of Egyptian kingship, becoming ghost pharaohs, rulers whose existence could only be inferred from fragmentary evidence that had escaped the systematic destruction. The 19th dynasty continued and intensified this campaign of erasure. When later pharaohs needed to refer to the period at all, they used euphemisms like the time of the enemy from Akhetaten, or the rebellion, refusing even to speak Akhenaten's name. This systematic destruction was so successful that by the time of classical antiquity, the Amarna period had been almost entirely forgotten. Greek and Roman historians make virtually no mention of Akhenaten or his revolution. The magnificent city that had housed tens of thousands became a wasteland of broken stones, gradually buried by the shifting sands of the desert. Yet the very thoroughness of this erasure campaign inadvertently preserved what it sought to destroy. By using artanist stone blocks as building material, the destroyers unknowingly created hidden archives of the very art and inscriptions they meant to obliterate. The desert site of Akhetaten, abandoned and forgotten, was preserved by its very isolation, waiting for modern excavation to reveal its secrets. The phenomenon of Akhenaten presents us with one of history's greatest ironies. The campaign designed to obliterate his memory became the mechanism that preserved it for eternity. The priests and pharaohs who worked so systematically to erase every trace of his existence succeeded so completely that they inadvertently created the perfect conditions for his resurrection in the modern world. Had Akhenaten been remembered as just another failed pharaoh, his story would likely have been lost among the countless dynastic struggles that filled 3 millennia of Egyptian history. Egypt had experienced other religious reforms, other capital relocations, other periods of internal strife that were dutifully recorded and eventually forgotten by all but specialized scholars. But great lengths to which his successors went to eliminate every trace of his existence. The armies of craftsmen deployed to destroy his monuments, the careful rewriting of king lists, the abandonment of an entire capital city, created a mystery that demanded explanation. The ruins of Akhetaten, preserved by their abandonment, became a time capsule more complete than any conventional tomb or temple. Because the city had been evacuated so suddenly, it retained a coherence and immediacy that older Egyptian sites had lost through millennia of reconstruction and reuse. The Amarna Letters survived precisely because they were abandoned and forgotten. The reused stone blocks from Aten temples created inadvertent archives scattered throughout Egypt. Even the systematic defacement of Akhenaten's cartouches became a form of preservation. The negative spaces where names had been carved away, serving as ghostly signatures of the erased pharaoh. This preservation through destruction extended to the realm of ideas as well. Because Akhenaten's theological innovations had been so suppressed, they retained a freshness and radicalism when rediscovered that gradual evolution might have dulled. His monotheism appeared to modern scholars as a concept that had been violently rejected by its contemporary society. Whether his ideas directly influenced later Jewish and Christian beliefs or reflect parallel human responses to the divine, his reign showed that monotheistic concepts could emerge independently in the ancient world. The question of his motivation remains equally contentious. Most modern scholars see both visionary conviction and political calculation as genuine aspects of his complex personality. He may have been a sincere religious reformer whose personal beliefs happened to align with his political interests, or a pragmatic politician whose reforms took on a life of their own. The ultimate failure of his revolution offers important lessons about the nature of historical change, that even the most radical innovations must accommodate themselves to existing social and economic realities if they are to survive. His reign illustrates that individuals can indeed alter the course of history, that personal vision and determination can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. But it also shows the limitations of individual power when confronted with the deep structures of society and human nature. Do you see Akhenaten as a visionary reformer or as a reckless zealot? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more content. Thanks for watching.